On February 14th, 1349, 2,000 Jews were burned alive in Strasbourg.
Valentine's Day.
Valentine's Day. And the plague had not yet arrived in the city.
That's the thing that stops you cold when you first encounter it. The massacre didn't happen because plague came to Strasbourg. It happened before plague came to Strasbourg, which means something else was driving it entirely.
What was driving it was a Europe that had already been living under pressure for decades before anyone in Strasbourg saw a single body with swollen lymph nodes. To understand what the plague broke, you have to understand what was already bending. And what was bending was an entire social order, one that had taken roughly 2 centuries to construct, that rested on a single foundational assumption: that human bodies were abundant and cheap.
Say more about that, because I think most people hear medieval Europe and picture something static, like the hierarchy just existed and everyone accepted it.
The hierarchy was real, but it wasn't static, and it wasn't inevitable. It had a specific material cause. Starting around 1000 CE, European agricultural technology, the heavy plow, the 3-field rotation system that let farmers rest and replenish a third of their land each season rather than exhausting it straight through, the horse collar that let horses pull a plow without choking, which made them genuinely useful as draft animals for the first time, made it possible to cultivate land that hadn't been cultivable before. Population expanded enormously, and as it expanded, the ratio of people to arable land shifted decisively in favor of landowners. By the early 14th century, England alone had probably 4 to 6 million people, estimates vary, living on roughly the same agricultural base that would later support fewer than half that number after the plague. The land was full. In fact, it was overfull.
And when land is the only thing that matters for survival, being the person who owns it gives you total leverage.
Total leverage. A peasant family in 1300 had essentially no exit options. You farmed the Lord's land under whatever terms the Lord set, because the alternative was starvation. Lords could and did demand labor services, fees for milling grain, fees for using the oven, fees for inheriting land from your father. The technical term historians use is serfdom, but the mechanism was simpler. When labor is plentiful and land is scarce, labor has no bargaining power. None. The economic structure did not require cruelty to be exploitative. It required only that there were always more hands than there was work to give them.
Which is exactly the kind of system that looks permanent until it isn't, because nothing about it feels like it's contingent on some external fact that could change.
And that's what's worth sitting with. The people inside this system, the lords, the church, the peasants themselves, had no reason to think the ratio of bodies to land was a variable. It had been increasing for 300 years. The only direction anyone had ever watched it move was upward. The assumption of surplus labor wasn't an ideology someone invented. It was lived experience, reproduced across generations.
The church especially had built something elaborate on top of that assumption.
The church had built everything on top of it. And here, the mechanism is slightly different. The church's leverage came not primarily from land, though it owned enormous amounts, but from its monopoly on meaning-making in conditions of suffering. When people were dying of famine, when children were dying of dysentery, when there was no medical explanation and no legal remedy, the church offered an account of why. Suffering was penance. Poverty was proximity to Christ. The priest stood between you and salvation was the only escape from a life that offered very little else. This only works as a power structure if the suffering is chronic and the alternatives are absent. A population that could feed itself and negotiate its own wages had much less need for that particular exchange.
So you've got two interlocking systems, the feudal labor system and the church's spiritual economy, both of which depend on the same underlying condition. Too many people, not enough options.
And then, in the summer of 1347, Genoese trading ships arrived at the port of Messina in Sicily. The sailors were already dying. What they carried moved at 1 mile per day overland and 24 miles per day by sea, and it doubled its infected population every 43 days.
Those numbers don't stay abstract for long. 24 miles per day by sea means the Mediterranean is weeks, not months, and a disease doubling every 43 days in a population with no prior exposure?
The mathematics are unforgiving. What makes those numbers particularly significant is what they tell you about the thing that was actually spreading. We'll get into the pathogen question in depth, and it is genuinely unresolved in ways most people don't realize. But what the spread pattern tells you is that by 1349, this was not confined to port cities or trade routes. It was moving through the interior. It was in the countryside. It was in the monasteries. It was in places that had never seen a Genoese merchant.
Which is when it starts to become not just a catastrophe, but a civilizational problem. Because the church and the feudal order don't just lose people, they lose the conditions that made them legible.
That's exactly right. And this is where the Strasbourg massacre becomes something more than a horror. It becomes a diagnostic. Because what happened in Strasbourg in February 1349 was not a mob driven mad by grief and panic responding to deaths they'd watched in their own streets. The plague was not in Strasbourg yet. What the massacre tells you is that the pressure, the fear, the need to assign cause, the need to find a target was running ahead of the disease itself. The catastrophe didn't create that pressure. It revealed pressure that was already there.
And I keep coming back to who actually organized the killing, because the word pogrom sometimes calls up an image of crowds running wild, but this wasn't that.
It was not that. Samuel Cohn's work is unambiguous on this point. The Jewish massacres of 1348 to 1350 were, in city after city, planned by local Christian governments. This was administrative violence. In Strasbourg, the city council that had been trying to protect the Jewish community was actually removed from office by a local guild coalition, the butchers and tanners and craftsmen, who replaced them with a council willing to authorize the killing. Then the burning happened. 2,000 people on Valentine's Day.
And the statistical pattern that researchers found later is one of those findings that you read and then have to sit with for a while. Because it's not just that cities with pogroms in 1349 showed higher hostility toward Jews later. It's that the specific cities that conducted massacres in 1348 to 1350 showed higher Nazi Party vote shares in 1928, higher deportation rates after 1933, more synagogue destruction in 1938, even in cities where the Jewish community had been entirely wiped out in 1349, and Jews had been absent for 600 years.
The Voigtländer and Voth finding. 6 centuries of lag. What it suggests, and this is genuinely disturbing to sit with, is that the violence encoded itself into the institutional structure and social memory of those places in ways that outlasted the victims themselves, outlasted any living connection to the original event, and expressed itself again when conditions made that expression possible.
Which is a different kind of claim than people remembered and passed it down. It's more like the local government, the local church, the local economy had been organized around the exclusion of a group, and that organizational logic persisted as a kind of groove that later generations fell into without knowing why.
The document that survives from Strasbourg, the actual decree authorizing what happened, is careful and bureaucratic. It doesn't read like a document written by people in a panic. It reads like a document written by people who had made a decision.
Which brings us back to the question of what the plague was actually threatening. Because if this is a story about protecting an existing order, and I think it is, then the question is what that order was protecting, and from whom.
The Jewish communities of medieval Europe occupied a specific and deliberately maintained economic position. Canon law, the church's own legal code, prohibited Christians from lending money at interest, which created a niche that Jewish merchants and moneylenders filled by necessity and by exclusion from other trades, which meant that when a lord or city needed capital, the transaction often ran through Jewish hands, which meant that debts to Jewish creditors were a concrete, legible financial relationship, and canceling those debts was one of the most direct material benefits a government could offer its constituents.
So some of what looks like religious violence was also debt cancellation.
Strasbourg's debts to its Jewish community were substantial, accumulated across decades of municipal borrowing that the city's own records document in detail. When the community was burned, those debts were extinguished, the property was seized, and the thing nobody mentions about this is that it happened in February before the plague arrived, which means it wasn't even rationalized as plague prevention. It was rationalized as the well poisoning accusations, the ritual murder accusations, the confessions extracted under torture from people who would confess to anything to make the torture stop. The justification was assembled after the decision.
And you can see in all of this the same system doing what it does when it's under pressure, finding a way to maintain the existing distribution of power against a threat it can't fully name yet.
Because the threat it couldn't name was simple, that the plague was going to kill enough people to make labor scarce, and when labor became scarce, the fundamental ratio on which everything rested was going to invert, not gradually, not in ways that left time to adapt, but within a decade.
The modern version of this, and I keep coming back to it, is any moment where a major productivity shock arrives and the institutions that depend on the old equilibrium can't update fast enough. You see the same violence of trying to hold the line, the same tendency to target a group that's already marginal rather than confront the structural change.
The surplus labor social order of medieval Europe had been stable for so long that it had stopped being visible as a contingent arrangement. It felt like nature. Lords owned land and peasants worked it, and the church administered salvation, and that was simply how the world was organized. What the plague was about to demonstrate, not as an argument, but as a brute biological fact, was that all of it rested on a precondition that could be removed, that the entire architecture was load-bearing in a way nobody had tested.
Farm wages in England doubled between 1350 and 1450. Think about what that single fact contains. A wage structure that had been suppressed for 2 centuries by sheer surplus of labor, moved in the space of a generation to a new equilibrium, and then stayed there for 450 years.
What makes that number remarkable is not just the magnitude of the change, but the speed. The Statute of Laborers in 1351 tried to freeze wages at 1346 levels, which were already below pre-war norms, depressed further by the costs of the 100 Years' War, the Crown understood immediately what was happening and tried to legislate against it. The statute didn't work, not because it was ignored in a general sense, but because the employers violated it. Lords competing for scarce labor quietly outbid each other. The statute was law at Westminster and fiction in the countryside, and everyone knew it.
And nobody connects these two things, the massacre in Strasbourg and the wage statute in London, but they're the same gesture. They're both institutions that assumed one world, trying to survive in another world. One through violence and one through legislation, but the same basic refusal.
The document that survives from the Westminster Abbey auditor is telling. He crossed out a payment that exceeded the statutory rate with the notation quia statuta, because of the statute. Someone watching, someone marking violations. A few miles from the center of power, there was monitoring. On distant estates, there was none, because there couldn't be. The Black Death had made the periphery of the kingdom functionally ungovernable by ordinary means, because the market was overriding the law in every transaction involving labor, and nobody had enough eyes.
And all of that is still ahead of where we are right now. In February 1349, the plague hasn't reached Strasbourg yet. The full mortality is still accumulating. The wage revolution is still a decade away. What we're standing in right now is a Europe that knows something catastrophic is moving toward it, can see it in the ships arriving from the south, can see it in the mortality figures coming from Italy, where the death toll in some cities was going to exceed 50%, and is beginning to fracture in ways that tell you exactly where the pressure had been building.
The flagellant movement had already begun by this point. Groups of men, sometimes hundreds at a time, moving through German and Flemish towns, whipping themselves publicly in elaborate rituals they believed would substitute for the ordinary sacramental economy of the church, the confession, the penance, the priest's absolution. They were doing an end run around the institution that was supposed to mediate between them and God. And their arrival in towns, as we'll see, bore an operational relationship to the pogroms. The flagellants and the massacres traveled together in ways that suggest not coincidence, but pattern. What looks like chaos, the burning in Strasbourg, the processions, the ships at Messina, is a set of legible responses. People and institutions who can feel the ground moving and are trying to do something about it before they understand what it is.
Which is exactly what institutions do. They don't wait to understand the threat. They act on what the threat resembles.
300 years of one ratio between bodies and land. One summer for that ratio to begin its inversion. And the question that everything else in this story depends on is what actually happened in the years between, not just to the bodies, but to the institutions, the laws, the stories people told about who they were and what they deserved, and who was to blame.
And where those institutions tried to hold the line, and where they couldn't.
And which of those lines are still holding.
This is Pulse, Origins, produced by Singularity Pulse Network. Views expressed are our own. New episodes every Sunday. Follow us on @thepulsespn on X, the Everything app.
I'm Caden. The Pulse Brief is every weekday, 10 minutes. AI, space, crypto, cybersecurity, what matters most today? Find it wherever you listen.
I'm Knox. Every Saturday on Pulse Deep Dive, one story, the history, the present, and what comes next. Find it wherever you listen.